Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hello, welcome to the church library. I'm Kelsey McGinnis.
And I'm Marissa Burt, and we are glad you're joining us here for conversation. You can have tea or coffee in this church library. So,
Right.
grab your cozy drink of choice and gather around for a little.
Were you not allowed to have beverages in your church library?
I don't know. I just can't envision anything. I feel like no libraries had beverages when I was a girl. Do you remember?
I don't think our church library had any rules. It was I think it also doubled as a conference room, if I remember correctly. It was it was a wood paneled room with a giant conference table in the middle and just floor to ceiling bookshelves full of mostly old books.
Yeah, fair. Well, here it can be the imaginary space. We can have our imaginary wood panels, or we can have our coffee. And we're just glad you're joining us. This is our first kind of introductory episode. We wanted to tell you a little bit about our forthcoming book, which is available for pre-order. All the links are in the show notes. It is called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. And it is coming, is that accurate?
Yes. I say it wrong every time. Every time I say the subtitle wrong.
The title for this book has changed 4 times. And it's a lot of the same ingredients are in there. They've just been shifted a little bit. So sometimes it's for a while it was shaped families and then it became betrayed. So sometimes our messages fritz out. But that is the title. You'll see it in the show notes. If you're interested, we'd love for you to pre-order it. There's some little freebies if you do. But in this episode, we wanted to talk about our book a little bit, introduce you to ourselves and our work and what our hopes for this podcast. So here we are.
Here we are. Yeah, so The Myth of Good Christian, I'm just going to say the first part of the title every time. I'm never going to say the subtitle because I'm going to get it wrong. But yeah, so The Myth of Good Christian Parenting comes out in October of 2025. We cannot wait. And we also are sort of left looking at our own libraries of books that we read as we were working on this book and thinking, oh man, we didn't get to talk about that one and that one and that one and that one. There are just so many Christian parenting books out there that have remained really influential and important for families. And one thing that we try to do in our book is talk about some of the ideologies that are sometimes kind of hiding underneath the advice in these books. And it's just sort of presented to parents as this timeless Christian wisdom, when a lot of the time it's really not. And as you can imagine, in one book, there's just not enough space to talk about all of these. So as we have wrapped up the writing and the initial editing, we wanted to continue talking about some of these books that come up in our conversations all the time and interactions with people on social media who ask, did you read this book? And yes, we did, but we cut out the paragraphs where we talk about it. I'm so sorry.
Yes, we do get a lot of times people saying, what about this one? What about this one? And we even had to cut our index where we had the names of people. So we trimmed a lot, y'all, to get this unwieldy, so much research, so much reading into digestible format. But we have all this bonus content that we want to talk about. And because some of what we did in the book, to give you kind of the bird's eye view, is we did look at the history, the social influences, the kind of cultural impact of various ideologies, as Kelsey said, and frameworks that influenced all manner of American evangelical cultural life, really from the 1970s onward, though rooted even in things older than that. So kind of examining that, looking at some of the shared topics, because believe me, we probably read over 100 of these books, and some themes emerge pretty quickly once you read a few and you see the same ground being revisited in interesting ways. So we also looked at some of the reoccurring topics, and then we surveyed a number of individuals who had either grown up as children under these teachings, or were older parents reflecting back on family life who had trusted these teachings, and kind of hearing some of people relating their own experiences, the impact that it had on them. And so we discussed that throughout the book as well. So it's a lot to pack into one book. We're so excited and pleased, I think, aren't you? I'm pleased with the result. I am just eager for it to be out there. But yes, so much more we want to talk about. So here we are in the church library, ready to talk about these musty, some not so musty, some still circulate to this day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we really do. We dip into a lot of books and talk about a lot of individuals throughout the book. But some kind of merit more discussion. Yeah. There are some that come to mind that people keep on telling us, you have to talk about this book. It was so influential in my church, or my parents used this book and then they gave it to me, and all the parents at my church now use it still. And some of those books are really recognizable names, I would think, for a lot of evangelicals, like Shepherding a Child's Heart, which came out originally in 1995 and still circulates really widely.
Oh, yeah.
Then there are some
recommended all the time. Just a couple weeks ago, a really well-known megachurch pastor was actually kind of attempting to bring a needed corrective to the kind of authoritative, easily offered biblical parenting advice. And he wrote a kind of extensive post on that. And when someone asked in the comments, well, what do you recommend? Shepherding a Child's Heart was his first recommendation. So it's still highly recommended and circulating. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. It really, it still makes the rounds. And, we go way back into kind of some of what I would call the first popular Christian parenting books of the 20th century by people like James Dobson. Dare to Discipline came out in 1970. So did another, maybe lesser known now, book called The Christian Family by Larry Christensen, which was incredibly popular at the time. I can't tell you how many people I interact with who come from both like mainline Protestant churches, but also evangelical churches, who would say, oh, Larry Christensen, he was like the person that we all read this book. It sold a ton of copies. I can't remember the number now, but that one
over 1 million sold. I think, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, it is a lot. And he was quite influential. That name doesn't really exist in the evangelical sort of pantheon of influential names.
He didn't really turn to politics or social issues, maybe because he was a contemporary of Dobson's.
Yeah. But he was in like the kind of charismatic Lutheran world at that point. So, I mean, sort of related to evangelical world of the time, but he didn't really kind of like link arms with the religious right in the same way that Dobson did, which I think that explains some of Dobson's rise after Dare to Discipline. So those are two books that we look at quite a bit. Some other, the Ezzos. I was not super familiar with the Ezzos and Baby Wise until we started working on this book. I think I had read some of the kind of more horrific stories about the fallout of their teaching. Had you run into Baby Wise much?
Actually, when this would have been early 2000s. I was, if you don't know, I'm married to an Anglican priest. And at the time I was in seminary. I was pregnant with my first child at an Anglican church, and they were doing Growing Kids God's Way. And I did not know, I didn't know anything about anything at that time. I hadn't read, and we ended up moving away from the area before we had a baby. But that was the first time I heard that name. And then I think when I was like in my 20s, a family I like nannied for had used Baby Wise. So in that headspace, before you're even thinking about having children, I just remember being like, oh, well, their child goes for a nap really easily and like filed that away. But I wasn't aware of the religious connotations until much later when I realized, oh, the Baby Wise is linked with this thing that the church's, small group for young parents was doing. And
John MacArthur's church, not just any church. This is John MacArthur's church.
The church I went to, but yes, John MacArthur made them made them rise to fame and influence. But I thought about that a lot lately or as we were writing this book, because certainly if I had, as a brand new mom, been like, well, what should I do? Like, who am I looking for? I would have gone to that seminar, and I probably would have not questioned it, really, because you're trusting the older parents around you who kind of are saying this really helps or this will be good, and you feel so overwhelmed. So I've thought about that a lot lately, because I wouldn't have known. I would have just been like, all right, that's great. That is God's way to grow kids, So anyway, yes, the Ezzos. We do want to do a podcast. So we're thinking of doing an episode on an individual resource or person. So maybe one week next time we want to talk about Shepherding a Child's Heart and Ted Tripp. We want to talk about the Christian Family and Christensen. We want to talk about the Ezzos. We want to talk about Dobson. We want to talk about To Train Up a Child by the Pearls, because we get a lot of requests for it, and also because I think it's important to acknowledge the extremity of that belief and also the commonalities it shares, even though it is often presented as like, these are extreme and fringe beliefs and have caused so much harm. And there's a lot on the internet about how much harm that has caused. But to say, well, a lot of this overlaps with a lot of the more mainstream titles as well. So that's when we want to revisit. What else did we talk about revisiting?
Oh, well, so not Ted Tripp, but Paul David Tripp. Yeah. They are brothers. Paul David Tripp is a pastor. I cannot remember where he pastors, but he is the author of a parenting book, a more recent one, I think 2015, called Just Parenting, that we get a lot of requests for. I know a lot of people who really enjoyed that book and found it helpful, or at least encouraging. M is for Mama by Abby Halberstadt. I'm saying that right. We get asked that one a lot. But I'm always looking for people on social media just to say what they're reading and what's being recommended to them. I haven't been looking for books for myself. I've been looking for the books for our book. But I know that there are more being written all the time. It is a self-replicating market, the parenting book market, because new parents are popping up all the time. People are having children all the time. And so I think one thing that is difficult about studying parenting books is that a lot of what shows up in them, it's a lot of the same thing over and over again, because people read these books for a very short period of their lives, and then they don't have a reason to revisit them again. So if the same basic information is being sort of repackaged in a different way from one generation to the next, it kind of goes unnoticed. So there's a lot of like weird generic Christian parenting advice that just kind of goes unexamined, right? Like you read it when you have young kids and toddlers, especially. I think baby care books and sort of toddler behavior books are the most popular. Books on like parenting teens are popular too, but really it's those like first years that parents read a bunch of stuff, go buy a bunch of stuff. They're looking for resources. And then when that stage of life is over, they just kind of move on. And that reality, I think, is what ends up giving a lot of these books a pass, because there's just no one really wants to go back and revisit that or feels a need to.
And I think it's why some of the same ideas continue to recycle. I don't think it's because, as we make the case in our book, a lot of them, it's not because they're timeless truths or biblical truths, but they become kind of colloquial truths where it's like, then the person who's maybe got kids in their late teens, early 20s, who sits down, someone asks them to write a parenting book, or they're an influencer who people are asking parenting questions, and they have their personal experience, and then they maybe draw on some of those ideas they remember from those earlier parenting books. And maybe it shifts a little bit with vocabulary or something, but it's pulled out again for a new generation, because what is going to be the impetus to re-examine these ideas unless you're going to get everybody in the same room reading the book again, and you have maybe adult children who now are parents themselves reading these resources, and they begin to see it differently now as parents, or you might have older parents reading it again and thinking, what, after they have maybe experience of raising children through adulthood or parenting adult children, they maybe would think differently about it. But it's rare to have that opportunity. And I think you see some of that in the internet, in internet spaces, right? People will reread these books or discuss shared experiences in forums. They begin to see, oh, wait, that was strange, or I see that differently now that I'm the parent to a child. I think differently about that response. That was kind of scripted from these parenting books. And I was often surprised. Sometimes I wasn't, because you read some of these books and you kind of know what you're getting to. But some of them I was surprised. Ones where I thought would be more robust biblically. They made claims to being very biblical or something, and there was not much substance under that, even attempt to root things in biblical ideas. Just a lot of Christian-y vocabulary thrown about, or things I thought were more gentle or tempered were not at all. They just had a more polished exterior than something like To Train Up a Child. So, it was interesting to read the primary sources and be like, wow. And then to try and place them in the historical, to situate them historically, which I think is really helpful, lest we so easily look back and point easy fingers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think one thing that we really tried to drive home in the book is that these books are a product of the time and the place and the people
and the desires and fears and audience need. All of it.
Yep. And a lot of these books are, sort of reactionary in their posture toward the world, and it helps understand where the authors are coming from and why they're concerned about the particular things they are. If you look at the historical moment, like, I cannot tell you how many passages there are in some of these books that really call out just these random things, like James Dobson has this whole extended thing where he's spending some time in London, and he's walking down the street and he's commenting on all these teens who have dyed hair and pierced ears and noses, and he's going on and on about how we've lost control of youth. And it's just very obvious that he just really doesn't like youth culture in London, and he then extrapolates this whole worldview on, like, the youth of today are anti-authoritarian and civilization is going to collapse if we don't fix this problem. And there are just so many things like that. And when you go back and look at what year did he write this? What came before it? What was happening politically?
What was he responding to? Yeah.
Yeah. What were the cultural panics? It makes a lot more sense. And it's easier to, I think, have grace with parents who were won over by these books when you realize that a lot of these books aren't just selling advice, they're selling a worldview and the diagnosis of the world.
And hope.
And
and promises. That's why in our subtitle we say false promises, because there are a lot of big promises made in these books, both explicitly and implicitly, kind of like, it'll all work out if you do it right. And a reason they sold well or became household names is because they appealed to people's longings, and parenting is a vulnerable moment. It's a vulnerable moment where you're maybe desperate for some of that. So it can be easier to see some of it from a distance. Like the London example, I think, is a good one, because you're kind of like, that one make a reel today or something. Other things would be decried, but the the desire to point to something and be like, that's a sign of how bad everything is getting, is still there and still quite effective, whatever it looks like in the new generation. So there's so much we want to explore. So we want to do episodes with resources. We also would love to interview a few people. We have a short list of people we'd love to interview and have a conversation with. We want to, in a way, do on here what we do in the appendix. There's an appendix, one appendix made it into our book. And it is a tool to help readers kind of ask critical thinking questions about any resource that they're reading. Because one of our primary goals, it is not one of our primary goals, is to offer parenting advice ourselves or to even really recommend resources or not. I mean, there may be a few where we kind of are like, this should just go in the bin. This one needs to be out of print and retired. But a goal we would have for readers would be to help equip you to kind of see through some of the smoke and mirrors that comes from all these promises and all this kind of biblical terminology and this market, really, to be able to discern, like, is this a resource I want to learn more from? Where does this fall on the, like, am I getting green flags? Am I getting red flags? Like, how do I even begin to evaluate? So we'd love to even just do that in real time with some of these resources, talk through different elements, point out things we know of, like, oh yeah, this is common, or this is a clue of an antagonistic relationship between parent and child, or things that we have observed after reading many of these books. And we also hope that appendix might be downloadable. I think we're going to try and create it into a downloadable tool that will be part of like a pre-order bonus. So we're recording these episodes in advance. So hopefully that will be complete by the time we publish them, and you can check out the pre-order link to see how to get your hands on that too.
And just to echo what you said about one of our primary, it not being a goal of ours, yes, actually explicitly a goal to not, our goal is to not offer any parenting advice, and even to recommend things. One of the questions we get most often is, what resources do you recommend? And every time I'm asked about this book, almost the first words out of my mouth are, it's not a parenting book. It's not a parenting advice book.
Dodging it.
Yeah. Yes. Because, people ask, oh, what are you writing a book about? And I'll say what it's about, like, oh, it's a parenting book. No, it's not a parenting book. It's a book about parenting books. But we try to be really explicit about that. I think, for a number of reasons, but obviously because we've just spent, a year looking through all of these books and just seeing how ill-advised it can be to try to offer parenting advice that is generalizable to all, how that can go badly, and just how quickly that can devolve into trying to fix a social problem that you think you see by telling people how to raise their children. I cannot tell you how many of these books that are, I think, in the minds of most people, pretty neutral, just offering advice. But gosh, there's almost always something in there that is the author sort of looking at the world and trying to socially engineer a fix to a problem through how we raise children, which is almost unavoidable. And I don't, that's not even necessarily to say these authors are doing bad things. It's just
a good number are, a part of why we're so cautious is a good number are well-intentioned people who have ministry desires or who want to share, they want to support or encourage other parents. And that's all really understandable. I think that's sometimes those are the harder resources, I think, to read, where you see people who clearly they love the Lord, they care about other Christian parents, they would love to help other families, and on that road, they decided to normalize their own experience as determinative and authoritative for everyone, and they connected a dot there that needed a lot more disclaimers.
Yes.
And it's impossible to do that when you're even what we're doing here, which is a conversation together. We're both moms, we both have things we've picked up along the way or things we like or don't like. But it's really different for me to be like, hey, Kelsey, here's something that happened with my child today, and here's something I tried, is really different than telling untold numbers of people my idea is going to be immediately helpful, let alone God's way to parent, you know?
Yes.
So I think a lot of these resources, it's clear that people were intentionally trying to build parenting empires. They were trying to influence culture. They were trying to change politics. In some instances, they were trying to establish the church or grow the church or make money. And then others, it seems like they maybe stumbled into it or were trying to help. And often that will be part of their origin story. Like I'm thinking even of the Ezzos, who when we talk about them, they just were like, we were in our living room talking to other couples and it just grew. And that's how they describe it. And man, that can get away from you really quickly.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So we've just spent a good while talking about our project, about what we want to do with this podcast, why we're here, all of this. But we realize that for a lot of people listening, if you're still listening, you don't know anything about us. So we did think maybe we would spend the rest of this first little introductory episode introducing ourselves and sharing a little bit more about the origin story of this book and how it's taken shape and what we bring to this book background wise. So Marissa, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about this even when you were talking, Kelsey, about how we were talking about parenting books are reactionary and they're placed in a certain time. And I was like, that's even true of our book. I don't know if I'd call it reactionary, but it is placed in our time, speaking to a moment in our era, I think. A moment of a kind of deconstruction, a kind of thinking critically about teaching that has come before. So anyway, that's adjacent to what we're talking about. But my interest in this topic is a number of things. One of them is, I mentioned earlier, I'm married to an Anglican priest. My husband, Aaron Burr, is a priest and has been, we've been in parish ministry for over 20 years now, church planting and local parish ministry. And so a big piece of my interest in this project is just hearing people's stories over the years, both adult children and older parents, reflecting back on their experiences, many coming to confusing or painful moments of reckoning where they maybe feel like they did all the right things that the books told them to or the church told them to, and it didn't turn out the way they'd hoped, or there's painful estrangement or inauthentic connection. And yet these messages are still being told to people over and over again. And when that happens and it doesn't turn out well, but people have told you this was God's way, you become the problem. And there just comes with a lot of shame and a lot of extra pain, because if the teaching is uncritiquable, then either you or your child or you or your parent are particularly flawed, that it didn't work for you. So seeing that painful reckoning, for me, it aligned with seeing some of the things going on as churches were reckoning with sexual abuse crises and disclosures and an inability to respond appropriately. I saw a lot of parallels there between when survivors of abuse would come forward publicly with their story or tell a church leader, how they would be responded to, how things would be minimized, how people would be left, how there would be no accountability for people who'd maybe hurt others or for teaching that had contributed to harm. A lot of parallels with what was happening in Christian families. And so that was of interest to me, how ideas and theologies and teaching and catechesis contribute to unhealthy communities, painful, difficult things in families, all done in the name of God. So all of that, this is kind of like a big thing altogether, was a big piece of it. And I'm not exactly sure. I have a master's in theology, studied church history. I love the history of the church. I love every corner of the church. I'm ecumenical at heart. I always will say, as long as there's living water, I will drink at any well. I really do love an ecumenical approach to church. So loved studying church history. In undergrad, I studied sociology, so loved studying sociology of religion and ancient Greek, Koine Greek. And so I'm a church history Bible study nerd as well. But as a result, I care a lot about when I see problematic or distorted theologies. And I think not just biblical illiteracy, but also ignorance of church history, particularly in the Protestant tradition, can really keep us vulnerable to all sorts of people making claims in God's name or claims about what the Bible says. So all of that combined to make me interested in this project. And one day, this is where our stories combine, Kelsey. One day on Twitter, a friend of mine had tweeted out something like, if you had all the time and could write about anything you wanted, what would you write about? And up until this point, I'd written a number of novels. I'm a novelist and I've written middle grade novels. But I had been toying around with this idea of a nonfiction book, which had always felt daunting. And it is daunting. It's a really different process to write a nonfiction book. But I was thinking about a book that really critically examined Christian parenting teaching, looked at what people had been taught. At the time, I really wanted to survey. I was like, we could do some kind of peer-reviewed research, studying the impact. And we talk about in the book why that's almost an impossibility with family life research. But I was curious to see what could we do, because I really suspected that we would find a lot more estrangement and kind of people hiding from these painful realities in the pews, in church pews, than we were talking about in church spaces. Really felt like people were isolated in that. So I tweeted out something more articulate, because you only have however many characters to tweet about it. Just a really brief thing about that, like this book concept. And the response was fascinating. Like, people were responding, and at just even in the few followers I had on Twitter at the time, like, people were like, I would read that. That would resonate. We need that. Please write that book. It was interesting to hear that it struck a chord with something people were interested in reading about. And then...
Yeah. I did not know you. I did not follow you. Right. I wasn't spending hardly any time on Twitter at this point. But I did see that tweet, and I was like, I've been thinking about this
so glad you did.
For a long time. I know. And I almost got cold feet. I felt so like, this is so out of my lane. What do I possibly have to say to this person? but yeah, so I'm a writer for Christianity Today. I'm a musicologist. So I write right now a lot about congregational worship practices, about music in church life. I write about the Christian music industry. I've been doing that since 2021 or so. I teach at a small liberal arts college in central Iowa, in both the music and theology departments, and love doing that. My dissertation work was on propaganda and the use of music and the arts more broadly as a tool for indoctrination of prisoners of war. So I've always been interested in the ways that art, specifically music, gets weaponized, or people try to use it to win hearts and minds to a cause, or to change the way people feel about something. But parenting books were a very niche, off the normal path interest of mine, because I was a parent of young kids in evangelicalism and was finding myself very confused and disheartened by the books that I was encountering for a number of reasons. So I don't even remember what I said in that message I sent you. I think I said something along the lines of, hey, this has been a weird interest of mine for a long time. a couple years ago, when my oldest was maybe 1.5, my husband, who is a journalist and a professor as well, we had started doing some research about shepherding a child's heart and Christian parenting literature, just between the two of us. I don't even know what we had in mind, but we were so struck by how different the advice we were getting from like the tried and true Christian parenting books and some of the, I don't know, more mainstream recent parenting and child development world that we were also looking into. I should say I was also working at the time at the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights, which is a think tank and research center. And one of the grant projects that center had when I was there was about child labor. And so I had, in my first years there, spent some time just kind of drinking through a fire hose about child labor laws and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and was very used to children being talked about in different terms than they are talked about in the church. And I found that disparity to be troubling. But I also felt very uncertain about my own ability to parse those things because I'm not a theologian. I start with questions of culture first. Like, you know, I'm more of a cultural historian. And so I just found myself saying, like, I might be wrong about everything. Like, what if I am doing my children a disservice by not talking about sin enough? What if I am robbing my children of coming to know God in their young years by not being this kind of Christian parent that I feel like I should be? And so we had sort of gotten into those questions as new parents, but it didn't really go anywhere. We felt like we had we reached a place where we were like, I just don't think these Christian parenting resources are right. And we just sort of moved on. We were sort of like, you know what? Like, I think this is wrong. I hope that there are better ones out there somewhere. We found some things that worked for us and our children. And that was sort of it. So when I saw your tweet, I was like, oh man, even if I could just sort of send some of the stuff that we found or be a sounding board, I would love to, because this is fascinating.
Your offer was kind of like, if you need any like help or research. I mean, it was a really, and I remember being really excited because I was like, this is a writer for Christianity. I'm interested in this book idea. You know, I just was like, oh, that's exciting. And we set up a Zoom and we were like, great vibes. Do you want to do this together? Like that was kind of it, which was wonderful. And I think we talked more about our interests and idea for the book at that Zoom, but it was exciting. I remember being so glad you reached out.
Yeah, it was great. And I sort of look back and like, I'm so glad I did, because I definitely almost did not. Like I wrote a message once and then just deleted it and then went back to it the next day. So I am thankful that happened.
We talk about, I don't know if we don't talk about this in the book, but I think we both bring complementary skill sets in a good way, coming at this from different angles. Like Kelsey, for sure, when we're writing the chapters about the history and the American cultural influences, brought so much insight into that. And I appreciated that so much. And I tackled the theology of sin, some of those chapters. And I think our skill sets, I don't think if either of us had written this book as individuals, it would not be as strong as it is. I think together it ended up being a more comprehensive, cohesive, thorough exploration. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, same. I'm so out of my depth when it comes to the theology and the hermeneutics of it all. Those just are not it's not my skill set. Obviously, I am a Christian. I value the Bible, but that is not my training, and it's a historical text that I take very seriously. And so the idea of trying to write something that would try to help people, that's just so outside of what I am capable of doing. So I was really, really glad to work on this with someone who can and does it really well. So we are really excited about it. And we're excited for next week. I should have mentioned one of the first books that I was given as a new parent that sort of sent us down that research rabbit hole was Shepherding a Child's Heart. It was, I think it was the first book that was given to me. And I remember reading it and I just felt utterly confused. And I think I was reading it at the same time as I was finding resources like, I want to say it was like The Whole Brain Child by Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel. Maybe even like I found Janet Lansbury has a podcast called Unruffled. Her thing is, I think she calls it respectful parenting. I think a lot of people would probably put her in like the gentle parenting camp. And I'm not really here to advocate for any of those particular resources or approaches, but the stark contrast between these things was so troubling to me. Yeah. And I just couldn't quite get past the way that Ted Tripp talked about sin in children and the parent's role in correcting that sin or judging that sin. I couldn't quite get past it. And I think a lot of people have a similar experience with that book. And it's a book that we often get questions about. And so it's the first one we're going to talk about. We'll spend the whole next episode talking about that book.
Yeah. And I didn't read Shepherding a Child's Heart until we were researching for the book. But I do remember the feeling of, for me, I can still remember this a little older. So it was at the Barnes and Noble is where I did my reading. There was not like online. I mean, it's the early days of mommy blogging, but I wasn't reading those. So I remember scouring for the sleep books. Like I was desperate for that. Like I remember, and we should probably say like we both are moms. I'm the mom to 6 children over a spread of a couple decades. So I'm familiar with some of the older resources, probably newer ones. But for me, and I've written about this on Substack elsewhere, I had kind of as a newlywed been sucked into some of the Christian marriage books, the really like authoritative, didactic Christian marriage books, and had kind of that lasted a couple years and then imploded and walked away from some of that framework. So thankfully, I look back, by the time I was exploring parenting, I was a little bit burnt out on looking for manuals to help, because that hadn't necessarily been a help. It's not like I didn't read parenting books or glean good things or find some that I liked or some that I didn't like, but it was less of a like fill my shelves with all the resources, I think. So it's been interesting to revisit some of these for the first time. Like in my mind, Shepherding a Child's Heart was before I read it, I was like, oh, that's a gentler guide. I don't know if because it had shepherding in the title or something. And so when I read it in like December of 2023, would that have been? I was shocked and did a whole exhaustive chapter by chapter deep dive on social media. So I've talked about this book a lot if you are interested in shorter clips, but I'm so excited to have a live back and forth conversation about it next week as well, and really talk through all the threads that run throughout it, because Dobson, I feel like, is one of the biggest names, but I think Shepherding a Child's Heart has had maybe the longest reach as far as influencing parents. I don't know how many parents are still picking up Dare to Discipline. Maybe there are a few, but I don't think so. I think some maybe are still consulting Focus on the Family or something, but I think a lot of people are still following Shepherding a Child's Heart. Yeah,
I think that's right. So we hope that you join us again next week in the library. You can pre-order The Myth of Good Christian Parenting right now. The links are all in the show notes. You can find them. You can also find links to our socials. And we're just excited that you're here. Excited you found us.
Thanks for joining the conversation.
Yeah. We'll see you next time.
In the church library. Didn't say it. Didn't catch.
Hold on.
I can get that off.
Can you cut? Okay. Hold on. Oh, there.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksburt
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.